I never imagined an airport terminal would be the place where my family finally broke. My name is Claire Reynolds, and on that gray morning, I stood by the check-in counter, watching my father pat my grandfather's shoulder and say, "Just sit right here. We'll be back after check-in." He said it lightly, almost tenderly, but something about the moment felt wrong, the stillness in my grandfather's eyes, the way my parents walked away without once looking back. Minutes passed, then half an hour, and a cold certainty began to settle in my chest. They weren't coming back. The man who taught me what love meant was being left there like forgotten luggage in a place meant for departures. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to choose between what's right and what your family demanded. I grew up in Omaha in a house that always looked like it was waiting to be photographed for a magazine. The lawn was perfect, the shutters white, and the silence inside sharper than any sound. My father, Dr. Henry Reynolds, believed in precision, his shirts ironed, his words measured, his children obedient. My mother, Margaret, filled her days with charity luncheons and galas, smiling for cameras, but never for comfort. From the outside, we were the picture of a respectable family. Inside, we lived by unspoken rules: stay composed, stay quiet, and never embarrass the name. I was the eldest, the one expected to hold it all together. Straight A's, piano trophies, hair pulled back neatly in every photo. To them, that was love earned, not given. But Grandpa Walter didn't believe in that kind of love. He was the only one who ever told me, "You don't have to prove yourself, Claire. Just be." When I was little, he'd take me to the park on Sundays while my parents were at their country club luncheons. We'd feed the ducks and read old books under an elm tree that leaned toward the lake like it wanted to listen. He called me Clary, his special name for me, and even now I can still hear him say it slow and kind, like the world would never rush us. His hands were rough from years teaching shop class, but they never shook when he turned a page. As I got older, those visits grew rare. My father said Grandpa was getting forgetful, that it was better for him to stay upstairs where it was quiet. The guest room door closed more often, and the air in our home changed. My mother began speaking about him in the past tense while he sat 2 rooms away. I still went to see him slipping up the stairs with cookies or his favorite lemon tea sitting with him as he repeated stories I'd already heard. He'd sometimes call me Rose, his sister's name, or talk about my grandmother like she was still alive. But when I laughed or touched his arm, his eyes would clear for a moment and he'd whisper, "Clary girl, there you are." By the time I turned 21, the forgetting had deepened. Some nights I'd find him standing in the hallway in his slippers, humming an old jazz tune from his youth. My father called it wandering. I called it remembering. He still smiled when I read to him, still hummed along when I played piano in the next room. But to my parents, he'd already become a burden. I heard them whisper about nursing homes, facilities, medical directives. They said they were being responsible. I thought it sounded like surrender. Then one evening over dinner, my father announced the plan like a gift. "We're taking a trip to South Africa," he said. "The whole family. One last adventure together." His voice was steady, his eyes too careful. My mother smiled the way she did when photographers were watching. Grandpa sat quietly, his fork resting in midair, not quite understanding. I wanted to believe it was real, that they were doing something kind before things got worse, but a small voice inside me whispered, "No one makes memories by leaving someone behind." Still, I went along. The morning of the flight, the sky glowed a faint orange as we loaded the car. Grandpa wore his navy cardigan, the one with sleeves too long. He clutched a framed photo of my late grandmother in one hand and my wrist in the other. My father kept checking his watch. My mother reapplied her lipstick in the visor mirror. I just kept watching Grandpa, memorizing his face in case something went wrong. He looked at me once and said softly, "You'll make a fine teacher one day, Rose." He only called me Rose when he was scared. The airport smelled of coffee and disinfectant. My mother handed me money and told me to grab coffee for her and Dad, something strong. I hesitated looking back at Grandpa in his chair, but she was already walking away. Dad leaned down to him, voice low and clear. "Just sit here, Dad. We'll go check in and come right back." The words felt rehearsed. They disappeared down the corridor together. My parents calm, collected, not a single glance backward. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Grandpa sat where they'd left him, staring through the window at the planes, still clutching Grandma's photo. After 20 minutes, I asked the woman at the check-in desk whether the Reynolds family had checked in. She nodded cheerfully. All confirmed. Boarding in 20. My stomach dropped. All confirmed. That's when I knew they weren't coming back. I turned and saw him still sitting there alone in that wide terminal, full of noise and strangers waiting patiently, because that's what good men do. My heart pounded as I started to move toward him. The truth was so clear it hurt. The trip wasn't a vacation. It was an escape plan, and I was the only one left who hadn't abandoned him. When I reached my grandfather, he was still sitting exactly where they'd left him, his shoulders curved forward, his hands trembling over the photo of my grandmother. The sound of boarding calls echoed overhead, and each one made him flinch a little as if he expected his name to be called next. I knelt in front of him, trying to keep my voice calm. "Grandpa, it's me. It's Claire." He blinked, confusion flickering across his face, then whispered, "Rose." I shook my head gently. "No, it's okay. You're safe." His hands were cold, and I wrapped them in mine until I could feel a bit of warmth return. The air felt too bright, too sharp. I looked toward the departure gates, but my parents were nowhere in sight. They had done it. They'd really walked away. When I helped him to his feet, he hesitated, his eyes darting toward the gate signs. "Aren't we going somewhere?" he asked, his voice frail but steady. "Yes," I told him softly, "but not the trip they planned." I led him toward the main exit, one small step at a time. The scarf around his neck was slipping, and I tucked it closer, as if the fabric itself could protect him. We reached the end of the concourse just as I heard my name called sharply from behind. My mother's voice carried across the tiled floor, controlled but furious. She was standing by the escalator, phone in hand, her heels clicking as she hurried toward us. "Claire, get back here right now." My father followed silent, his jaw tight. "He doesn't even know where he is," my mother snapped when she reached us. "He needs care. You don't know what you're doing." I took a breath, steadying myself. "I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm not leaving him here." My father's voice was low and sharp. "You're making a scene. Think about how this looks." I met his eyes. "How it looks." My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "He's your father." For a moment, no one spoke. The sounds of the airport moved around us, the buzz of conversation, the shuffle of luggage wheels, the soft hum of a distant announcement. I could feel every second of silence pressing against my ribs. Finally, I said it, quiet but final. "You left him." My mother's lips parted like she wanted to respond, but no words came. My father's gaze dropped first. I turned away and tightened my grip on Grandpa's hand. "Come on," I said softly. "Let's go home." My father started to speak again, but I didn't wait to hear the words. We walked out into the cold morning light, the automatic doors hissing open like a sigh of relief. I hailed the first cab I saw and helped Grandpa inside. He leaned against the seat, still clutching the photo frame, his breathing slow but steady. Neither of us spoke as the cab pulled away, the airport shrinking behind us until it disappeared in the side mirror. Only then did I exhale. The driver glanced at us through the mirror, once curious, then focused back on the road. I didn't know where we were going yet, but I knew it had to be somewhere safe. At the bus station downtown, the air smelled of diesel and coffee. I helped Grandpa out of the cab and guided him to a bench. He looked tired, his eyes drifting from the tiled floor to the people rushing past. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I had saved weeks ago, one I had never thought I'd need to use. "June Parker," I whispered under my breath. My great-aunt Grandpa's sister. She had called a few months earlier asking how he was doing. If anything happens, she'd said, "You call me." I hadn't known what she meant then, but I did now. The phone rang twice before she answered. "June, it's Claire," I said, my voice unsteady. "Grandpa needs you. We need you." There was a pause, a sound like a soft intake of breath. Then her voice came through, warm and certain. "Tell me where you are. I'll be waiting." I bought 2 bus tickets for the next departure to Kansas and guided Grandpa aboard. The driver helped lift his small bag into the overhead rack, and I thanked him quietly. We found seats near the window, the air conditioning humming gently. Grandpa leaned against my shoulder and fell asleep before the bus even left the station. We rode for hours past the flat stretches of farmland and sleepy towns that blurred into one another. I watched the world slide by the telephone poles, the old barns, the fields turning gold in the morning light. Somewhere between Nebraska and Kansas, I stopped feeling afraid. The weight in my chest eased, replaced by something quieter. I didn't know what waited for us, but I knew it couldn't be worse than what we'd left behind. When the bus finally slowed to a stop in Holton, the air felt different, still almost tender. Outside the station stood a small woman in a denim jacket holding a cardboard sign that said, "Walter plus Claire," in uneven letters. Her silver hair was pulled back, and her smile wobbled like she was trying not to cry. "Aunt June," I called out. She dropped the sign and came toward us, her hands already reaching for my grandfather. "Billy," she said softly, calling him by the name only family used. He blinked confusion, giving way to a faint smile. "Junebug," he said, voice barely above a whisper. She laughed through her tears. "You still remember that, huh?" We followed her home down quiet two-lane roads bordered by open fields. Her house sat at the edge of town, its paint chipping, and its porch wide enough for 3 rocking chairs. Inside, everything smelled like soup and cedar. She had a quilt folded over the couch and a small wood stove crackling in the corner. There were no intake forms, no facility paperwork, just care given without question. She showed Grandpa to a small room overlooking the yard and helped him into bed. When she came back to the living room, she handed me a steaming mug of tea. "You did the right thing," she said quietly, "even if they can't see it yet." That night, after Grandpa fell asleep, I sat on the porch while June rocked beside me. The crickets sang in the tall grass, and for the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel heavy. "You can stay as long as you need," she said. "This house has room for people who still see each other." I nodded, the words catching somewhere deep inside me. I didn't have to explain what had happened at the airport. She already knew enough to understand. In the days that followed, we settled into a gentle rhythm. Mornings started with oatmeal and black coffee, afternoons with short walks around the block when the weather allowed. Grandpa sometimes mistook the neighbors for old friends, but he always held my hand. Sometimes he called me Clary, sometimes Rose, and once in a while he said my name clearly, Claire, and those moments felt like sunlight through cloud cover. I began to write again in a small notebook, jotting down the things he said, the stories he repeated, the way he smiled when the radio played old jazz. I didn't write for anyone but myself, just to hold on to what was still here. A week later, I enrolled in a part-time nursing aid course at the community college in town. I told June I wanted to learn how to care for him properly, but she just smiled and said, "You already know how. You've been doing it." Still, I wanted to understand more to do better for him and for the people like him. Some evenings, while Grandpa napped, I studied at the kitchen table, my books spread out beside a plate of cornbread. June would hum while she washed dishes, and the house felt full, not in noise, but in presence. One afternoon, while I was studying, she came over and set a hand on my shoulder. "You were meant for this, you know." I shook my head. "I'm not sure I'm strong enough." She smiled. "You don't have to be strong all the time. You just have to stay." I thought about that long after she went to bed. Maybe strength wasn't in grand gestures or loud defiance. Maybe it was in the quiet act of showing up, even when no one else does. By spring, Grandpa's memory had softened even more, but his presence filled the house. He hummed while June cooked, tapped his fingers to the rhythm of rain on the porch roof, and smiled when I read aloud from the same books he once read to me. Some days were harder than others, but there was peace in the knowing that he was safe, seen, and loved. As I watched the sun set over the Kansas fields, one evening I realized something I hadn't felt in years. For the first time since that morning at the airport, I wasn't waiting for anything, not approval, not forgiveness, not permission. I was exactly where I was meant to be. And still I knew the story wasn't finished yet. There would come a day when I'd have to face the people who left him behind and decide what to do with what he left behind for me. Life in Holton settled into something steady, almost tender, like a rhythm I hadn't known I'd been missing. Morning started with the sound of the kettle on the stove and the smell of cornbread in the oven. Aunt June liked to hum as she cooked, her voice low and rough from years of working outdoors. Grandpa would sit by the window tapping his fingers to the tune, sometimes staring out at the garden as if searching for something only he could see. I learned to move quietly around him to measure time, not by clocks, but by how long it took him to finish his oatmeal or the way sunlight shifted across the porch. When the weather was good, I'd take him for slow walks down the street. He'd shuffle beside me, his arm looped through mine, asking the same questions over and over: what town we were in, where Grandma had gone, why the trees looked so tall. I always answered like it was the first time. Some days he'd call me Clary, other days Rose. But now and then he'd look right at me, eyes clear for a heartbeat, and say my name softly. Claire. Those moments were rare, but they stayed with me long after the fog closed in again. In the afternoons while he napped, I worked on assignments for my nursing aid course at the small kitchen table. The lessons came easily, not because I was a natural student, but because every page reminded me of him. I took notes about memory care communication and the small comforts that made a difference: familiar music scent and touch. When I read aloud from my textbooks, I could hear his voice from the living room faintly humming along to the jazz station on the old radio. Aunt June teased that he could find rhythm in anything. "He's got more music left in him than most folks ever start with," she said one evening, handing me a fresh cup of tea. That spring, I started volunteering twice a week at the local memory care unit attached to the Holton Medical Center. The first day, my hands trembled as I signed in. The hall smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender, the way hospitals sometimes try to disguise their sharp edges. The patients were kind, though most didn't know who I was or why I was there. One woman named Margie would take my hand every time and say, "You came back." I never corrected her. I'd sit beside her while she told the same story about her wedding day, how it had rained right after they said their vows, and how her husband called it a blessing. Another resident, Mr. Duncan, spent hours tracing shapes in the air, saying he was measuring the light. When I asked what he meant, he smiled and said, "You have to hold on to what you can still see." His words stayed with me for days. I began to understand that memory isn't just facts, it's feeling rhythm, the things that make you reach for someone even when you've forgotten their name. When I came home from the facility, I'd sit beside Grandpa and tell him about the people I met. Sometimes he'd nod and say, "Sounds like good company." Other times he'd just look at me and smile as if proud without knowing why. By early summer, Grandpa's condition had changed. He still ate well, still enjoyed the sound of the radio, but his awareness flickered in and out more often. He started waking in the night, confused about where he was. I'd find him sitting on the edge of his bed looking out the window. "I have to go," he'd whisper. "She's waiting for me." I'd sit beside him until his breathing slowed, until he drifted back into sleep. The next morning, he wouldn't remember any of it. Aunt June said it was a normal part of the journey, but it never stopped feeling heavy. We kept our routines as best we could. June tended to the garden, and I helped her hang laundry in the warm Kansas wind. Sometimes Grandpa joined us, folding towels with methodical precision. Once, when I handed him a sheet, he smiled faintly and said, "You always liked helping your grandma." I didn't correct him. I just folded beside him, the sun warm on our shoulders. That July, the nursing course required clinical rotations, so I began spending 3 days a week at the care unit. It was there that I met Nurse Evelyn Hart, a woman in her 60s, with a calm voice and eyes that seemed to carry decades of understanding. She taught me how to communicate when words failed, how to notice what the patient needed, even when they couldn't say it. "It's not about curing them," she said quietly one afternoon. "It's about giving them moments that still feel like living." At home, I tried to do the same. When Grandpa grew restless, I played his favorite jazz records, letting the saxophone fill the house until his shoulders eased. When he forgot how to hold his spoon, I guided his hand gently. When he laughed at something invisible, I laughed with him. Love had shifted from memory to presence, from talking to simply being there. One afternoon while I was studying on the porch, Aunt June joined me with 2 glasses of lemonade. "You know," she said, "I think he's holding on because of you." I didn't answer right away. The thought made my throat ache. "He's holding on because there's still something to hold," I said finally. She nodded. Maybe that's the same thing. The weeks passed quietly, each one blending into the next. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when Grandpa would grow frightened, asking to go home, not realizing he was already there. I'd kneel beside him and remind him gently, "You're safe, Grandpa. You're with me." Slowly he'd calm down, the panic fading from his eyes. I started keeping a small photo album by his chair, filled with old pictures, him as a young man, my grandmother in her Sunday hat, the two of them dancing in their kitchen. I'd show him the pictures, and sometimes just for a moment he'd remember. By late August, the doctor in Holton confirmed what we already knew. His memory loss was advancing faster. There wasn't much left to do except keep him comfortable. That night after we put him to bed, Aunt June and I sat on the porch. The air was thick with the smell of cut grass. She looked at me and said, "When the time comes, you'll know what to do." I thought about those same words Grandpa once told me in the backyard years ago before everything changed. When the time comes, you'll know what to do. That night I couldn't sleep. I went to check on him around midnight. The lamp by his chair cast a soft glow across the room. He was awake, eyes half open, humming a familiar tune under his breath. I sat beside him and took his hand. He turned his head slightly and said clear as day, "You're doing good, Clary, real good." For a moment the years fell away, and I saw him the way he'd always been, strong, kind, steady. "I wish I could have done more," I whispered. He shook his head slowly. "You did the one thing that mattered. You stayed." The next morning I printed the photo we took together at the bus station, the one where he was bundled in my scarf, eyes closed against the sun. I framed it and placed it beside my bed. I wanted to remember that moment, the beginning of this quiet chapter that had changed everything. As summer faded into fall, I began preparing for something I couldn't yet name. The air grew cooler, the nights longer. I found myself journaling more, not just about Grandpa, but about what staying had taught me, the small, wordless language of love, the courage and stillness, the peace that comes from choosing the harder road. And though life in Holton was calm, a part of me knew the calm wouldn't last. Change was coming again, quiet, but certain, like a shift in the wind before a storm. I didn't know what form it would take, only that it would test everything I had built here. Still, when I looked at Grandpa sleeping by the window, the radio humming softly in the background, I knew one thing for sure: whatever came next, I wouldn't look away. Winter came quietly to Holton, wrapping the town in slow mornings and short days. The garden behind Aunt June's house froze over, and the porch creaked under a thin layer of frost. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the faint scent of coffee and the steady hum of the radio. Grandpa spent more time in his chair by the window, wrapped in a worn blanket, his hands folded neatly over his lap. I'd grown used to measuring the days by his rhythm, the way he stirred his tea 3 times, before sipping, the way his gaze lingered on the same oak tree outside. But that winter, something in his silence began to change. At first it was small. He'd forget where he was, call me by the wrong name, then correct himself with a faint smile. But by January, the confusion came more often. Some mornings he'd wake up frightened, asking when the bus was coming or whether his students were waiting for him. I'd sit on the edge of his bed, smoothing the blanket, telling him he didn't have to go anywhere. "You're home," I'd whisper. He'd nod slowly, though I could see he wasn't sure what that meant anymore. Aunt June said the forgetting had softened him, but I knew it was erasing more than time. It was taking pieces of the man who had once held our family together. I tried to keep our routines alive. I'd still read to him after dinner old stories he used to love, The Secret Garden, Charlotte's Web, sometimes a short piece from the newspaper, just to keep his mind active. He didn't always follow the words, but his eyes stayed on my face, listening to my voice, as if the sound alone was enough. One evening, when I finished a chapter, he looked up and said, "Your voice sounds like her." I asked who he meant, and he smiled faintly. "Your grandmother, when she read by the fire." I hadn't realized I was crying until he reached for my hand, his thumb tracing small circles the way he used to when I was little. Around that time, my nursing rotation moved to the night shift at the care unit. The hours were long, but I didn't mind. The quiet of those halls taught me something about presence, that sometimes caring wasn't about fixing, but about sitting beside someone until they felt safe enough to sleep. One of the patients, a retired schoolteacher named Alice, reminded me of Grandpa. She used to hum old hymns under her breath when she grew anxious. I started bringing in a small radio to play soft music for her the same way I did at home. The other nurses teased that I had the calm voice, the one that made restless patients settle. I didn't tell them it was his voice I was borrowing, the steady patience he'd once shown me. When I came home after those long shifts, Aunt June would have a plate of food waiting, even if it was midnight. "You look tired," she'd say, handing me a bowl of soup. "But you're doing good, honey." I'd smile, too tired to argue. Some nights Grandpa would still be awake, the radio playing quietly beside him. He'd ask about my day, though he rarely remembered the answer. Once half asleep, he said, "You're like her, you know, always trying to fix the world." I didn't ask who he meant that time. I just kissed his forehead and told him to rest. February brought more changes. Grandpa's hands began to shake more, his steps shorter and slower. One morning, he nearly fell trying to stand. I caught him before he hit the floor, my heart pounding. He looked embarrassed, muttering an apology. We started using a wheelchair for longer distances, though he hated it. "I'm not that old," he'd grumble. But when I reminded him we'd still go out to the porch for fresh air, he softened. "Only if you bring that radio," he'd say, the smallest hint of his old humor shining through. On a rare sunny afternoon, we sat outside wrapped in blankets, the sky pale blue above the trees. The radio crackled softly, playing an old jazz tune he loved. He was quiet for a long time, then turned to me, his eyes suddenly clear. "You're doing good, Clary," he said. The way he said it, gentle, certain, made something in me still. I knelt beside his chair. "I wish I could have done more," I said quietly. He shook his head, his smile faint but firm. "You did the one thing that mattered. You stayed." After that day, I began to notice how tired he looked. His breathing slowed at night, his naps stretched longer. Aunt June tried to prepare me, saying this was the natural course, that he was easing toward rest. I listened, but part of me couldn't accept it. I'd built my life around his presence, the daily care, the quiet companionship, the way his eyes still sought mine in the fog. Letting go felt like stepping into air. The morning it happened was colder than most. Frost clung to the windows and the house was silent except for the faint hum of the radio. I found him in his chair by the window, wrapped in his blanket, his hands resting on his lap. The photograph of Grandma still sat on the table beside him. He looked peaceful, as if he'd simply drifted off mid-thought. I stood there for a long moment before moving closer, touching his shoulder. "Grandpa." My voice barely carried. He didn't stir. I knelt beside him, resting my hand over his. It was warm, but still. Aunt June came when she heard me call. She placed a hand over her mouth, then quietly turned off the radio. We didn't speak for a while. There was nothing to say. When the nurse from town arrived, she confirmed what we already knew. He had gone gently, just as he'd lived, without noise or demand, surrounded by the people who saw him to the end. We buried him under the oak tree behind the house, the same one he liked to sit beneath on warm days. The ceremony was small, just Aunt June, a few neighbors, and me. I read a short passage from one of his favorite books, the story of a man who found peace by returning home. The soil was cold against my palms, but it felt right, grounding somehow. I didn't invite my parents, not out of spite, but because this was a chapter they had chosen not to belong to. That evening, after everyone left, I sat on the porch with Aunt June. The sky was streaked with pale pink, the air still. She reached over and squeezed my hand. "He'd be proud of you," she said softly. I nodded, unable to speak. The house behind us felt different now, quieter, but not empty. I could still hear him in the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the radio, the rhythm of my own breath. Later that night, I placed the framed photo from the bus station on my bedside table, the one where he was smiling in the sunlight, wrapped in my scarf. I whispered, "You can rest now. I'll remember the rest for you." Then I turned off the lamp and sat in the stillness, the kind that feels like both an ending and a promise. In the days that followed, letters began to arrive. Old friends from Omaha who'd heard through the grapevine, distant relatives offering sympathy. Most I left unopened, but one envelope stood out heavier, marked with a familiar seal. It was from a law office in Omaha, the same firm my father used to handle all of the family's affairs. I set it aside, unsure if I was ready to know what it contained. When I finally opened it a few days later, there was a single sheet inside a notification of a will reading. My grandfather's name at the top, the date and address below. For a long moment, I just stared at it, the words blurring together. He had made changes, ones my parents clearly hadn't expected. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Aunt June looked up from her chair when I walked into the kitchen. "Everything all right?" she asked. I nodded slowly. "It will be," I said, because somewhere deep down I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a reckoning that had been waiting since the day they walked away from him at the airport. The letter from the law office sat on my nightstand for days before I could bring myself to touch it again. It felt heavier than paper should, like it carried more than words inside. Aunt June never pushed, but I could tell she was waiting for me to make a decision. On the morning of the will reading, she packed me a thermos of coffee and a sandwich for the drive. "Take your time," she said, her hand resting on my shoulder. "You don't owe them anything, but you deserve to know." I nodded and slipped the letter into my bag, my hands trembling slightly as I started the car. The drive back to Omaha felt strange. Every familiar road looked smaller, quieter, as if time had taken the edges off everything I once knew. The city skyline appeared in the distance, hazy under a gray sky. I hadn't been home since the day I walked out of the airport with Grandpa. That version of me, the quiet, obedient daughter, felt like a ghost now. I parked outside the same law office my father had used for years, the polished brass sign glinting in the weak morning light. Inside, the air smelled of old books and floor polish. A receptionist with a polite smile led me down a hall to a small conference room. The lawyer, Mr. Peterson, a man in his 60s with kind eyes, stood when I entered. "Claire," he said softly, shaking my hand, "I'm very sorry for your loss. Your grandfather was a remarkable man." I thanked him, my throat tight. My parents were already seated at the long wooden table. My father looked drawn, his suit too crisp for the occasion. My mother avoided my eyes, her fingers twisted together in her lap. Mr. Peterson took his seat and opened a leather folder. "This is the official reading of Mr. Walter Reynolds's revised will," he began, "executed 6 months ago and witnessed by myself and my associate, Ms. Green." The rustle of paper filled the silence. My heart thudded as I realized the revision must have been made while Grandpa was already in Holton with us. I hadn't known. The lawyer continued reading the formalities. First the statements of identity, the declarations of sound mind. Then came the details. To Henry and Margaret Reynolds, he left a modest sum described as a token of acknowledgement. My father shifted in his seat, the color rising in his face. My mother's hand flew to her chest, but she said nothing. Then Mr. Peterson looked at me. "To my granddaughter, Claire Reynolds," he read, his voice steady. "I leave the remainder of my estate, including all personal savings, pension accounts, and the property located at 132 Willow Bend in Holton, Kansas. I do this not out of favoritism, but out of gratitude for the one who stayed." He paused, then added, "A personal letter accompanies this document." For a moment, the room went still. I couldn't breathe. My father's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. "This is ridiculous," he said sharply. "He wasn't of sound mind, you know that." Mr. Peterson closed the folder calmly. He was evaluated by 2 physicians the week this was signed. Both confirmed full capacity. My mother's voice came out small. He didn't understand what he was doing. Mr. Peterson looked at her kindly but firmly. "Mrs. Reynolds?" He understood perfectly. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My father turned to me, his expression tight, almost pleading. "Claire, this isn't right. He didn't mean for this to happen. You can fix this." I met his eyes for the first time since that morning at the airport. "No," I said quietly. "You can't fix what you chose to break." He opened his mouth, but no words came. Mr. Peterson handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Grandpa's familiar handwriting. "He wanted you to have this privately," he said. I took it with both hands, the paper soft and slightly worn at the edges. The sight of his handwriting felt like a voice reaching across time. After the meeting, I walked out of the building and sat in my car, staring at the envelope resting in my lap. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a folded letter and a check made out in my name. My eyes blurred as I began to read. My dear Clary, it began the words simple, unhurried. If you're reading this, it means I've gone where memories don't fade anymore. I don't know what you'll do with what I've left, but I trust you'll make something kind out of it. You saw me when others stopped looking. You gave me back the dignity of being remembered. That's worth more than anything I ever owned. Whatever you build next, build it in love. Keep remembering. It was signed simply, Grandpa. I sat there for a long time, the hum of traffic fading into nothing. The words felt both heavy and light at once. Eventually, I folded the letter back into the envelope and drove home. When I arrived in Holton that evening, Aunt June was sitting on the porch, a blanket around her shoulders, and 2 mugs of tea on the table beside her. She looked up as I stepped out of the car. "Well?" she asked, gently. I handed her the envelope, still sealed except for the letter I'd already read. He left everything I said softly. The savings, the pension, the house, everything. She studied my face. "And how do you feel about that?" I didn't have an answer. I just sat down beside her, the cold air brushing against my skin. After a long silence, I said, "It feels like he trusted me with something bigger than money." We sat there for hours, the stars slowly appearing over the fields. I told her about the meeting, about my parents' reaction about the letter. When I finished, she took my hand. "He knew what he was doing, honey," she said. "He was setting things right in the only way he could." That night, I placed the letter in a small wooden box beside Grandpa's photo. I couldn't sleep, so I walked through the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the little details he'd helped restore when he first moved in. It felt less like an inheritance and more like a promise, a reminder that the life we'd built together mattered. The next morning, I called the law office to confirm the transfer of the estate. Mr. Peterson told me there was one more thing, a small safe deposit box registered in my name, and my grandfather's left at a local bank. I made an appointment to view it later that week. When I arrived, the clerk led me to a quiet room and placed the box on the table. Inside was a collection of small keepsakes, his pocket watch, a photograph of my grandmother, and a small notebook filled with names and phone numbers. On the first page, he had written, "People who were kind to me." I flipped through the pages slowly. There were names I recognized from the care center, from old neighbors, and a few I didn't know. At the very end, he'd written a single sentence, "Kindness outlives memory." I traced the words with my fingers, realizing this was the last lesson he'd left me. When I got home, Aunt June was waiting on the porch again. "You found something, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, holding up the notebook. He remembered everyone who ever showed him kindness. She smiled, tears glinting in her eyes. "Then that's the real inheritance." We spent the rest of the afternoon making calls, reaching out to the people in that notebook. Old students, a neighbor from decades ago, a nurse from the hospital who still remembered him. Each conversation felt like uncovering a piece of his story that I hadn't known before. By evening, I realized he hadn't just left me money or property. He'd left a map of the goodness that had touched his life. As the sun set over the quiet fields, I looked toward the oak tree where we'd buried him and whispered, "You kept your promise." The wind moved gently through the branches, and for a moment I could almost hear him humming. Still, I knew there was one thing left to do, one final piece of closure waiting back in Omaha. The house where everything began, the place I hadn't stepped into since the day they left him behind. I didn't know what I'd say when I saw them again, but I knew it was time. I made the drive back to Omaha on a pale March morning, the same route I'd taken months earlier when everything still felt raw. The air was sharp, the sky a soft gray that seemed to hold its breath. I hadn't told my parents I was coming. There were no messages, no warnings, just the quiet certainty that I needed to see them face to face. I parked across the street from the house I'd grown up in. The lawn was still trimmed to perfection, the shutters painted clean white, but something about it felt hollow now, like a stage left standing after the play had ended. When I rang the bell, my mother answered. For a moment she just stared, her hand frozen on the doorknob. "Claire," she whispered. Her voice carried more surprise than welcome. She looked thinner, paler, as if the years since I left had drained the color from her. My father appeared behind her, his shoulders stiff, his expression unreadable. "We didn't expect you," he said. I nodded. "I know." She stepped aside, motioning me in. The scent of lemon polish hit me immediately, sharp and familiar. The house looked the same, everything in its place, not a speck of dust out of line, but it felt smaller. I sat on the edge of the couch while they hovered near the doorway, like I was a guest they didn't quite know how to greet. "I heard about your grandfather," my mother said finally, her hands twisting together. "I wanted to reach out, but—" Her voice trailed off. I nodded again, unsure how to answer. "He passed peacefully," I said quietly, "with people who loved him." The silence that followed was thick enough to fill the room. My father cleared his throat. "We didn't mean for things to happen the way they did." I looked at him, the man who had once seemed so sure of everything. His posture was rigid, but his eyes were tired. "You did mean to," I said softly. "You left him at that airport and walked away. You knew what you were doing." My mother flinched but didn't deny it. My father started to speak, then stopped. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope Mr. Peterson had given me, the one containing Grandpa's final letter, and the legal papers that made everything official. I placed it on the table between us. "This is what he left," I said. "His estate, his accounts, the house in Holton. It's all settled now." My mother glanced at the envelope but didn't touch it. "He changed his will," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "He left everything to me." My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. I continued, keeping my voice calm. "There's a letter in there addressed to both of you. He wanted you to know it wasn't about punishment. It was about gratitude for being remembered when the rest of you forgot." I stood ready to leave. "I'm not here to argue. I just thought you should hear it from me, not a lawyer." My mother reached out suddenly, her hand catching my wrist. Her grip was light, almost desperate. "Claire," she said, her eyes glossy, "will you come home? We can fix this. We can start over." I looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, I didn't see the polished woman who always cared about appearances. I saw someone standing in the wreckage of her own choices, unsure how to move forward. "I am home," I said gently. "In Holton, with the people who saw me before I had to earn it." Her hand fell away slowly. My father stepped forward, but his words didn't follow. I could tell he wanted to say something, an apology, a defense, maybe both, but all that came out was a quiet sigh. "He didn't remember you most days," he said. "You know that, right?" I met his gaze. It was never about what he remembered. It was about what I wouldn't forget. I turned toward the door, pausing only once more before leaving. "Take care of yourselves," I said. "That's all that's left to do." My mother whispered my name as I stepped outside, but I didn't look back. The air outside felt cold against my skin, but it was the kind of cold that wakes you up rather than freezes you. I walked down the front path, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, and knew I wouldn't be returning. The drive back to Kansas was quiet. I didn't play music or roll down the windows. The road stretched ahead like a clean page, and for the first time I felt at peace with leaving something behind. When I pulled into the driveway of Aunt June's house, the porch light was on waiting. She stepped outside as I got out of the car, reading my expression before I spoke. "You saw them," she said. I nodded. "And it's done," I said simply. She smiled softly and held the door open. Inside the house smelled like baked bread and lavender. I sank into the old armchair by the fire, while June poured 2 mugs of tea. "He'd be proud," she said after a while. "Not because you inherited anything, but because you didn't let bitterness take root." I didn't answer right away. I just stared into the fire, watching the flames shift from gold to orange. "I think he just wanted things to end right," I said quietly. "And maybe this is as right as it gets." Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into work at the care unit. The patients seemed calmer when I was there, maybe because I knew how to speak in the soft tones that made them feel safe. I started leading small reading sessions in the common room, short stories, poems, sometimes passages from old journals. The staff noticed how the residents responded, and soon the sessions became a regular part of the schedule. It felt like something my grandfather would have smiled at. At home, Aunt June encouraged me to make plans for the future. "You could start a program," she said one night over dinner. "A place that helps families understand what dementia really is, how to care without losing themselves in it." I thought about it for days, and the idea began to grow roots. By spring, I had drawn up a proposal for a small community center attached to the Holton Care Unit, a space for education, art, and memory work, a way to help people remember the person behind the illness. One afternoon, as I walked through the backyard, the wind picked up, scattering the early blossoms from the trees. I paused under the oak where Grandpa was buried and whispered, "We're building something new, Grandpa. Something good." The branches swayed gently, and for a moment the air felt warm, despite the lingering chill. The following week, I received a letter from Mr. Peterson. Inside was a formal document confirming the full transfer of the estate, along with a note in his neat handwriting. "Your grandfather's legacy was never about wealth. He hoped you'd use it to give others what he found in you, understanding." I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my journal. By early summer, with June's help and the support of the care unit, the project began to take shape. We named it the Memory Garden, a space filled with light plants and music, somewhere families could sit with their loved ones and remember who they were beyond the disease. The first day we opened it, I placed a small framed photo of Grandpa on the windowsill, his smile reflecting in the sunlight. That evening, as the last visitors left, I sat on the bench by the window, the air still carrying traces of laughter and music. For the first time since he passed, I didn't feel the ache of loss pressing against my chest. What remained was something steadier, like the hum of the radio he used to love, always there in the background, quiet but constant. And as the sun dipped low over the fields, I knew the story hadn't ended at the airport or the graveside. It was still unfolding here in every hand I held, in every moment of remembering. But somewhere inside me, I also knew the past wasn't entirely finished yet. A part of it was still waiting to be faced, one last thread, tying me to the family I'd walked away from. By late summer, the Memory Garden had become more than I ever imagined. The first time I saw families sitting among the rows of flowers reading aloud to their loved ones, it felt like the house Grandpa built inside me had finally opened its doors. The scent of lavender filled the air, and wind chimes drifted softly in the breeze. Aunt June said it felt like peace had moved in and decided to stay a while. We held small workshops every Thursday, caregivers, nurses, families, each of them sharing stories about the people they were trying to remember. I'd listen, nodding sometimes, taking notes, sometimes just sitting in silence with them. It wasn't about solving grief. It was about making room for it. One afternoon, while I was tidying up after a session, a man in his late 30s approached me. He introduced himself as Daniel Price, a social worker from Topeka who specialized in elder outreach programs. He'd heard about the Memory Garden and wanted to learn more. We sat on the porch with iced tea while I explained how it started with one act of leaving, one act of staying, and everything that came after. He didn't interrupt or rush me, just listened the way people do when they understand what silence means. Before he left, he said, "What you've built here, it's what love looks like when it grows up." His words stayed with me long after his car disappeared down the gravel road. In early September, a letter arrived from Mr. Peterson, the attorney. The envelope was smaller than before, handwritten instead of typed. Inside was a short note. "Your parents have closed their practice and moved out of Omaha. A forwarding address was left in case you ever need it." I read the address twice somewhere in Colorado. For a long while I just sat there, the paper between my hands, the air around me still. I hadn't expected to hear from them again. Aunt June looked over from her chair and asked, "You thinking of going?" I hesitated. "Maybe," I said. "Not to reopen anything, just to finish it." 2 weeks later, I found myself driving through the Colorado foothills. The air smelled of pine and rain, and the road curved through quiet neighborhoods that looked nothing like the life my parents once clung to. Their new house sat on a small cul-de-sac, modest and simple. There were no polished cars in the driveway, no grand entrance, just a porch with a pair of rocking chairs. I parked across the street and sat there for a moment, unsure if I should knock. Then I remembered what Grandpa wrote in his letter, "Keep remembering." My mother opened the door before I reached it. For a second, she didn't recognize me. Then her face softened, and she stepped back. "Claire," she said quietly, as if the name itself might vanish if spoken too loudly. My father appeared behind her, slower this time, leaning heavier on his cane. "You found us," he said. I nodded. "I got your address." The house was smaller inside than I expected, lined with simple furniture, the air filled with the smell of soup simmering on the stove. We sat at the kitchen table, the three of us surrounded by the faint hum of the refrigerator. My mother poured tea without speaking. The silence between us was thick, but not angry, just worn out. My father looked older, his hair nearly white, his voice softer than I remembered. "We saw the article about your center," he said after a while. "The Memory Garden. They said you named it after him." I nodded. "In a way. It's for everyone who's ever been forgotten." He rubbed his hands together slowly. "You did good, Claire. Better than we ever taught you to." His words caught me off guard. I didn't know if they were meant as apology or acknowledgement, but I accepted them for what they were. My mother's eyes filled and she whispered, "He would be proud of you." I looked at her, unsure whether to believe it, but I said thank you anyway. There was one more thing I needed to do. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small envelope, the notebook page I had copied from Grandpa's list of kindnesses. I'd rewritten it neatly with their names included this time. "He remembered you," I said, sliding it across the table. "Even when he couldn't say it out loud. You were still in there somewhere." My mother covered her mouth with her hand, tears spilling over. My father just stared at the paper for a long time before folding it carefully and tucking it into his shirt pocket. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not hating us." I stood then, ready to leave. My mother reached for my hand, her grip trembling. "Will you come back?" she asked. I didn't promise, but I didn't refuse either. "Maybe," I said, "if the timing's right." Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, washing the sky in gold and violet. I walked to my car, feeling both lighter and heavier at once, like something had been set down but not entirely gone. When I returned to Holton, Aunt June was waiting on the porch as always. She didn't ask what happened. She just handed me a cup of tea and said, "You look like you've been somewhere important." I smiled. Maybe I have. We sat in silence, the night filling with the sound of cicadas. For the first time, I realized the ache in my chest had softened. Not gone, but gentler, like a healed scar you can still trace with your fingers. As autumn settled over Kansas, the Memory Garden grew busier. Local schools started bringing students for volunteer days, and families traveled from nearby towns to sit among the flowers. Daniel visited again, offering to help expand our outreach program. We began planning small workshops for grief support and early memory care. On the first chilly evening of October, he stayed late to help cover the plants before the frost. When we finished, he looked at me and said, "You know, sometimes people find their way back not by going home, but by building one." I didn't answer, but I understood. That night, after everyone left, I walked through the garden alone. The air smelled of earth and fading blooms. I stopped beneath the old oak tree, the one that reminded me of Grandpa's in Aunt June's yard. The wind moved gently through the branches, scattering a few leaves at my feet. I closed my eyes and whispered, "You were right, Grandpa. When the time came, I knew what to do." The stars came out one by one the same way they used to over the porch in Holton. I stayed until the chill reached my fingertips, then turned toward the path leading home. Tomorrow would bring new faces, new stories, and more people searching for the same thing I once was, the feeling of being seen. And even though I'd finally made peace with my past, I knew there was still one more step ahead. There was a dedication ceremony planned for winter, and I'd decided to name the main hall after him, the Walter Reynolds Center for Memory and Care. It would be my final way of keeping his story alive. I didn't know if my parents would attend or if I even wanted them to, but I knew I'd send the invitation anyway, because forgiveness in its quietest form was part of the legacy he'd left me. As I locked the garden gate that night, I caught a glimpse of the photo in the entryway, Grandpa smiling in the sunlight wrapped in my scarf. The porch light flickered softly against the glass, and I smiled back. It wasn't grief anymore that filled me. It was gratitude, steady and deep, like roots finally finding their ground. The dedication ceremony took place on a quiet winter morning, the kind that carried a soft kind of peace. Frost still clung to the grass around the memory garden, turning the edges of every petal and leaf into silver lace. The new plaque gleamed in the pale sunlight, the Walter Reynolds Center for Memory and Care. Beneath it, a simple inscription read, "For those who remember love even when memory fades." I stood there in my coat hands, tucked deep in my pockets, and felt the weight of the years settle into something that finally felt whole. Families began to arrive one by one, bundled against the cold, their voices soft but warm. Some carried flowers, others brought framed photos of loved ones who had once sat in our workshops or garden sessions. Daniel helped guide them inside his breath, visible in the chilly air. Aunt June was already at the front arranging a tray of muffins she insisted on baking herself. She caught my eye and smiled, that steady, wordless kind of smile that had carried me through so much. When the small crowd gathered, I stepped up to the podium. The microphone crackled once before settling into silence. I took a slow breath, the kind that steadies your hands and clears your heart. This place I began was built from one small promise to never stop seeing the people we love, even when the world forgets them. I glanced toward the photograph on the far wall, the one of Grandpa smiling in the sunlight. My grandfather, Walter Reynolds, taught me that love isn't proven through grand gestures or perfect words. It's shown in the quiet act of staying. I saw Aunt June wipe her eyes, and I kept going, my voice finding a rhythm between steadiness and feeling. When he left this world, I thought the story ended with him. But every person who walks through these doors reminds me that stories like his don't end. They continue in every act of care, every moment of remembrance, every bit of kindness passed on. The audience was silent, the kind of silence that feels like listening rather than absence. When I finished, I stepped back from the microphone, and Daniel took my hand for just a moment. "He'd be proud," he whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. The air was cold enough to make my breath visible, and for a heartbeat, it looked like I was exhaling everything I'd carried for years. Grief, guilt, love, all of it, into the light. After the ceremony, I walked alone through the garden paths. The winter flowers had been planted weeks ago. Pansies, primrose, and hellebores. They leaned gently in the wind, stubbornly alive against the season's chill. I stopped beneath the oak tree that shaded the entrance, the one we'd planted from a sapling the year the memory garden opened. I rested my hand on its bark and whispered, "We did it, Grandpa." Somewhere behind me, children's laughter carried from the main hall. Their voices sounded bright and unbroken, echoing through the space that now bore his name. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one sitting in that airport, frozen by disbelief and how far she had come. There was no anger left, no sharpness in remembering, just a quiet gratitude that the worst part of my story had given birth to something good. That afternoon, Aunt June and I stayed behind after everyone left. She poured us coffee in the small staff kitchen, steam rising between us like a curtain of warmth. "You did good, honey," she said, her voice soft but sure. "You carried him all the way here." I smiled. I think he carried me, too. We walked out to the porch together, the sky shifting into shades of rose and gold. The air smelled faintly of pine and earth, and I could hear the wind chime outside the door, its notes gentle, familiar, like the ones that used to drift from Grandpa's radio. Aunt June wrapped her scarf tighter and said, "It's funny, isn't it? The way things come full circle." I looked out at the fading light and nodded. He once told me that remembering someone is another way of loving them. I think he was right. When she went inside, I lingered a while longer. The lights from the center glowed softly through the windows, turning the frost on the glass into stars. I thought about my parents and the distance that still existed between us, how some bridges remain half-built, not out of bitterness, but acceptance. I'd sent them an invitation to the ceremony knowing they wouldn't come. Still, it mattered that they'd been asked. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reunion. Sometimes it just means peace. As the sky deepened to dusk, I closed my eyes and let the cold air fill my lungs. For the first time, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt like understanding. Life had found its way forward not by forgetting, but by remembering differently. When I turned off the last light and locked the doors, the garden shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Each plant, each stone, each whispered name etched into the walkway was a small act of defiance against time. I smiled, whispering one last thank you into the air, knowing that somewhere, maybe in memory, maybe beyond it, Grandpa was still listening. And if you've ever loved someone enough to stay when it was hardest or carried their memory long after they were gone, I hope you know you've already built something that lasts. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched your heart, share it with someone who needs reminding that love, when it's real, never disappears. It just changes form and keeps on growing.